Okay, so thanks to everybody who's stayed the course, and I know some people have joined us over the course of the day as well. We're nearly at the end of this first full day of our conference, and I think I certainly feel satiated already in terms of the ideas and the different sort of contexts and perspectives we've witnessed as part of the program. So thanks to everybody who's sort of seeing the course. We're into the last panel of the day, and it's going to be another hybrid panel. Two people who in the end couldn't join us. So we will have sort of two remote presentations first, and then one presentation in person. This is a panel on visual culture and the establishment, and I think these three speakers are going to bring a very interesting kind of combination of approaches to the question of self-determination in this context, and in sort of specific historic contexts, but also in ways that I think might sort of map onto the conversations we've been having over the course of the day. As with the previous panels, each presentation will be about 20 minutes. We have quite a bit of time at the end for questions. We'll see how we go. As this is the last panel of the day, we'll sort of we'll take as many questions as people have, and we might even reflect a little bit on some of the sort of broad thematics that have emerged so far. So I'll introduce the speakers one by one, and then we'll have a sort of panel Q&A at the end. So first of all, we're going to have a presentation from Gwen Farrelly, a remote presentation from Gwen Farrelly. Gwen is a PhD candidate at the Graduate Centre in CUNY. She's also an independent researcher and a consultant for global strategic development in arts organisations. She served as Rhode Island School of Design's inaugural Executive Director for Global Affairs and was the Assistant Director of the International Programme Department at MoMA in New York, where she oversaw global research initiatives and projects. She holds an MA in art history from the Courtauld and a BA in the history of art and architecture from Trinity. She teaches and lectures on global art history and has chaired, co-chaired and participated in global art history panels, workshops, conferences and think tanks. In 2020, she co-edited the publication Global Art Histories, Contexts, Methods and Approaches. And for her presentation today, she's going to talk about marginalisation through inclusion at MoMA, exhibitions of art from beyond Western Europe and the United States at the museum 1929 to 1952. So I'll hand over to Gwen.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. And I'd like to first start by thanking the organisers today for including me and also accommodating my last minute remoteness thanks to COVID-19. So thank you to Stephen O'Neill, Sophie Byrne, Lisa Moran and Jason Fallon, all the conference organisers today. And apologies in advance if my voice kind of breaks in and out. So as was just said, my name is Gwen Farrelly and my paper today is titled Marginalisation Through Inclusion at MoMA, and I'll focus on a set of 30 exhibitions in non-Western art that were held at the museum in its founding decades. Sorry, let's advance my slide. So I'm looking at the very early decades of MoMA, and here I'm just showing an image of the museum under construction, 1939. So actually for a large part of my talk, I'm looking at the museum when it was in its first iteration, which was in an office building near Fifth Avenue. And it was during that period that the museum's first director, Alfred H. Parr Jr., who we're looking at in an image here, created his now infamous maps and charts of modernism that are said to have codified the canon of modernism as a progression of Western European art movements and included art of the US and Mexico, as you can see at the top of his torpedo drawing here. Then he also did this very well-known 1936 line drawing that mapped the canon of modernism. Critics and art historians such as Christoph Grunenberg and Carl Duncan credit Barr in these diagrams with establishing the canon of modern art as one that largely excluded art beyond Western Europe and the US and envisioned a linear advancement of abstract movements towards the then pinnacle, American abstract expressionism. My research of this period at MoMA is informed by critical colonial theorists such as Anne Laura Stoller, who notes in her publication Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power that, quote, "Today, few students of the colonial world would claim that colonialism was more an economic venture than a cultural one, or that studies of the colonial can be bracketed from the making of the modern, of Europe and its nation-making projects," end quote. From this critical perspective, I revisit a set of 30 oft overlooked, if not straight up ignored, exhibitions at MoMA to argue that it was through Barr and his fellow curators' robust inclusions rather than the thus far presumed exclusions of exhibitions of art from outside Western Europe and the US that the museum marginalized art of these regions and further reinforced the narrative of modernism as Euro and North American centric, while also, I would argue, contributing to North America's efforts of cultural imperialism in the early 20th century. In 1942, and in contrast to the priorities reflected in Barr's charts that we just looked at, Barr proclaimed in a catalogue essay for the Latin American collection of the Museum of Modern Art that the museum now owns more Chilean paintings than British, more Brazilian than Italian. While Barr had cause to celebrate the vast collection of Latin American art at the museum, my study of MoMA's early exhibitions and display histories shows that art from outside Western Europe and the US, even that within its own collection, was limited to display in MoMA's exhibition program, so the temporary exhibition program. This is significant when viewed in light of Barr's 1944 report to the trustees, in which he characterized the permanent collection galleries as the realization of the museum's canon of modern art, while temporary exhibitions were positioned by him as, quote, adventurous and adventitious stories, end quote. Barr's choice of the word adventitious in this context is telling, given that the term typically refers to things that are brought together by an external factor or chance rather than design or inherent nature and assembled from the outside, so called outside. Through a close look at these exhibitions of works from outside Western Europe and North America, I'll show that in fact Barr and his peers actively crafted this value differential to reinforce a center-periphery dichotomy, the privileged modernist art of North American Europe. As noted already, during the period of focus for my study, the curators at MoMA organized 30 exhibitions of art from outside Western Europe and North America, which encompassed a wide range of artistic styles and periods and represented broad international scope. The sampling of these exhibitions includes such titles as American Sources of Modern Art, Aztec, Mayan, Incan, 1933. And here we're looking at the exhibition catalog and an installation photograph of that exhibition. 2 Centuries of Mexican Art in 1940, Art of the South Seas in 1946. And again, we're looking at the exhibition catalog and installation for that one. Japanese Household Objects in 1951, among many others. Far from the sole purview of Barr, these exhibitions attest to the highly diverse expertise and interests of a group of MoMA staff and partners, many of whom spanned simultaneous official, diplomatic, political, and curatorial roles, and who often had a deep knowledge of the regions of focus. These figures included, to name a few, James Johnson Sweeney, curator at MoMA and known largely in Ireland in this country for his role in curating the first Rosk exhibition in 1967, Lincoln Kirstein, a curator at MoMA, who during the war years, Nelson Rockefeller, who was then the president of MoMA and the US industry leader, had become the head of the US government's newly formed Office of International American Affairs and engaged the MoMA curator Kirstein to, and here I quote Michelle Greet's article in Kirstein, assess the state of contemporary art in Latin American cities, to purchase works for the museum, and to establish contacts for future cultural exchange. Covertly, he would also gather information on the degree to which Axis agents have penetrated Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, and report to the Office of Inter-American Affairs on the effectiveness of the US diplomatic corps in managing these advances. So a large remit for Kirsty. Also Monroe Wheeler, who oversaw publications and directed exhibitions at MoMA while also serving within the Office of Inter-American Affairs, and numerous other US and international curators, scholars, and partners. As such, a close look at these exhibitions reveals the intricate relationship that existed during this period between MoMA, its exhibitions, and the burgeoning program of cultural, economic, and political imperialism that the US was launching across the globe. Through a close reading of the relevant exhibition installations, catalogues, publicity materials, I claim that MoMA curators created three main exhibition typologies, to frame art from outside Western Europe and the US. In the larger study, from which my paper is an excerpt, I explore these typologies through a myriad of distinct case studies. For today's purpose, I focus primarily on the first of these exhibition typologies, which is exhibiting pre-modern artifacts to at once validate a still new European modernism and exoticize art of those places. And I'll do that through a close look at one of their exhibitions, Persian frescoes of 1932. Late in 1932, MoMA held this exhibition, Persian Frescoes, a temporary exhibition that ran for approximately a month, which was standard for their temporary exhibitions at that time. That same year, other than a single-person exhibition of the work of Diego Rivero, the other 7 exhibitions were specifically dedicated to art and artists from Western Europe and the US, inclusive of the now infamous Modern Architecture International Exhibition and a brief survey of modern painting. Persian Frescoes was organized in partnership with the Persian Art Institute, whose mission was to, quote from the catalogue, encourage and extend an understanding and appreciation of Persian art in its various forms by promoting research and assisting scholars, organizing and assisting archaeological expeditions, and assisting exhibitions of Persian art, both national and international, end quote. In staging the exhibition, MoMA was supporting the Institute in achieving its aims. At the Persian Art Institute, the exhibition was initiated and coordinated by its founding director, who we see here in an image, Arthur Upham Pope. The Institute was based in New York, and its board included key individuals for the study and dissemination to the West of an Iranian-approved vision of Persian art and culture across universities, congresses, publications, and fairs. Many of the individuals on the board worked with the Shah of Iran and/or their work was celebrated by the Shah. Most central of all was, of course, the director. Upham Pope started his career as an academic teaching philosophy at Brown University and later at the University of California. Pope left academia to become an art advisor to the Iranian government, as well as to Western collectors of Persian artifacts. Pope held a unique role then in which he shaped the tastes, interpretations, and values of Persian art for Western audiences, while also helping the Iranian government to shape their new national identity as Iran within the West through cultural engagements. Through collaboration and hosting of the exhibition at MoMA, the museum became part of this network and Upham Pope's platform for the dissemination of a new vision of Iran. The exhibition was the first public display in the United States of Sarkis Kachadorian's copies of the 17th century frescoes from the Ali Kapur and Shahil Sultan palaces of Isfahan in Persia, or today Iran. So this is one of those frescoes in situ, and this is one of Kachadorian's copies, which were on view at MoMA. Kachadorian was an Armenian artist who trained at the Accademia delle Belle Arti in Rome, and he worked in Constantinople, Armenia, India, and eventually settled in New York in 1941. The copies of the frescoes were realized with tempera on paper, and the exhibition had previously been on view at the Musée Guimet in Paris earlier that year, where it received high visitor numbers and much press and critical coverage. At MoMA, James Johnson Sweeney was selected to organize the exhibition at the museum in lieu of Alfred Barr, who was on extended leave. When passing on the baton for this exhibition to Sweeney, Barr wrote, and I quote Barr's letter, "The Persian show need cause you no worry. It's not a very exciting affair, but will, I think, make an agreeable minor exhibition," end quote. Barr's statement to Sweeney not only reveals how he considered this exhibition within the larger narrative he was crafting of the museum's collection and galleries at that moment, i.e. as minor, but it also shows his concern for the Persian works on view, which he describes in that same letter as, quote, fairly monotonous. Barr's attitudes, however, are in contrast to the museum's president and board leadership, who are typically concerned more with the diplomatic, economic, and political ambitions of such partnerships and exhibitions. In a letter from MoMA's then president, A. Conker Goodyear, to the museum's secretary, at around the same time as Barr's letter, Goodyear writes, quote, "I should prefer to have the exhibition on the first floor, as it will give it much more prominence," end quote. In promoting the exhibition, Goodyear was also concerned that the museum directly address in its press materials why MoMA will be showcasing reproductions of 17th century Persian frescoes. To respond to this concern in their materials, the Persian Art Institute and MoMA curators intentionally crafted a clear linkage to the focus of its own collection, i.e. modern and contemporary art of the West. And they can characterize the show in the following terms, by quoting many of the French critics. Quote, "The most surprising and interesting aspect of these paintings is their quality of modernism." They quote one critic. "They are distinctly in the post-war manner. Some of the portraits of women are like Marie Laurencin. The woman bathing is Modigliani. And if one wanted to go on with the comparison, one can find that the Ali Capu Picassos. And finally, evidently in the 17th century, the Persians were already imitating Henri Matisse," end quote. MoMA selected these quotes by French critics of the exhibition in Paris as a core part of their press release. It wrote to attract members of the public to the exhibition in New York. In so doing, they presented these works as imitative of French modernism that arrived over 2 centuries later. As such, in Persian frescoes, MoMA positioned the value of the artifacts from beyond Western Europe and North America on display in direct relation to their service to the formation of the canon of Western modernism. Indeed, in his letter to Sweeney, Barr noted, quote, "If you do see any not too specious resemblance between these pictures and such great modern artists as Marie Laurencin or Matisse, I'm sure our publicity agents would greatly appreciate it," end quote. The impact and legacy of MoMA's attitudes towards the Persian frescoes, and indeed artistic practices in Iran and Asia at large, is evidenced in some of the critical reception of the exhibition within New York art reviews for the show. For instance, critics of the New York Times and the New Yorker and other journals use such terms as pure delight, most joyous works of art, delicious color, a unique adventure for the art lover, and an enchanting group of pictures. These characterizations of the Persian frescoes call to mind terms often used in the 19th century to assign the so-called exotic and to other the art of the Middle East and Asia, and are fully in line with the way in which the museum chose to attract members of the public and their board to the exhibition opening, when they stated on the invitation that, quote, "Interest will be added to the exhibition by the presence of Madame Kachadorian, who is a guest of honor and will appear in native Persian costume," end quote. Though scant, if any, installation images of Persian frescoes at MoMA exist, this exhibition just proceeds when the museum thoroughly documents all exhibitions. We do know that the reproductions of the frescoes were of a scale similar to large-scale modernist paintings of the time, such as those of Picasso and Matisse. They were installed in MoMA galleries, where one typically saw modernist paintings and sculptures. Here's an example in this slide of one of those galleries, and through such installation would have further encouraged readings of these works in relation to modernist paintings. This approach to installation alongside the press materials and museum statements further these comparisons and analogies, all sought to ensure that the Persian frescoes were seen primarily in relation to European and North American modernism. The exhibition's role then was to create a prestige of lineage for Western modernism, which in the early decades of MoMA was still viewed with skepticism among New York and US audiences. The Persian frescoes were not, in other words, on view at MoMA to educate and elucidate the viewers to their context, their local meanings, the lives and work of the artist, the cultural context and significance of the works in situ, but rather as a backdrop to further the appreciation of MoMA's permanent collections. MoMA's display and use of the works on view in Persian frescoes recalls post-colonial theorist Frederick Bower's assessment of the display of ancient Eastern artifacts in earlier Western museums when he says, and I quote, "The object of representation is amended to fit the expectations and one could argue the needs of a specific Western audience," end quote. This approach to Persian or Iranian artifacts is in direct contrast to the collection and display of such objects in other US collections, such as the, albeit later, 3 decades later, collecting practices of Abby Gray, the founder of the Gray Art Gallery. I show some works from her collection, Albeit several decades later, Gray said of her approaches to collecting artifacts in Iran and Asia, quote, "I didn't look for miniaturists or gem setters in Iran. I didn't look for rug makers. In many places, I didn't know where to look exactly or what to look for, but whatever it was going to be, it had to express the response of contemporary sensibility to contemporary circumstances. In every country, I asked, where are you working artists? What are they doing? How are they breaking with the past to cope with the present?" End quote. In contrast to such a way of thinking or approach, MoMA aligned itself with an institute dedicated to more archaeological pursuits that grew out of the attitudes, approaches, and sensibilities of 19th century Orientalism, as is evidenced in Upham Pope's catalogue essay, in which he positions himself and the institute as saviors, Western saviors of the cultural heritage of Iran, which is beyond the local comprehension of entities, specialists, and visitors. He talks about these frescoes as having an air of awaiting discovery and salvation. The themes and approaches that emerge when looking at MoMA's partnership, its coordination, and the communication around the display of Persian frescoes are readily traceable across the other 29 exhibitions of non-Western art the museum held during this period. For instance, with the Persian frescoes, we saw the museum board and leadership commitment to MoMA being a platform for the development of economic, political, and cultural goodwill for North America as it grew its expansion goals outwards. This is even more evident in such exhibitions as Art from Fighting China, which was held in 1942. And although MoMA stated in a press release for this show that it wished to share with visitors a range of contemporary art in China, they collaborated with American businessman and politician Wendell Willkie, the philanthropist Henry Luce, and the Chinese government to showcase a very unique view of Chinese art in the month-long exhibition, Art from Fighting China. And the goal of this exhibition was really then to support MoMA's, the US interest in China at that period. So these approaches and themes continue to emerge across the other exhibitions of non-Western art, in which MoMA curators continue to display archaeological materials from the global south, largely as source material, inspiration, or exotic references from modernist painters and sculptors to further buttress and provide a lineage for the permanent collection. It is of note that my research in this paper sits within more recent revisionist histories of MoMA's founding decades, such as in What Was Contemporary Art by the art historian Richard Meyer, in which he re-examines Barr's approaches to the collection display of contemporary art. In his publication, Meyer looks at Persian frescoes, American sources of modern art, and a number of the other exhibitions that I explore. And for Meyer, his goal is really to look anew at these exhibitions to, in a way, recuperate Barr's legacy. And I'll quote Meyer in his goals when he says, "The experimental nature of MoMA in the 1930s and 40s, including its commitment to pre-modern exhibitions, has been lost or largely ignored by scholars who have characterized the museum and its founding directors narrowly modernist," end quote. While I'm indebted to Meyer's detailed discussions of Barr and these exhibitions, rather than join Meyer in recuperating Barr's MoMA from claims of Eurocentrism, the goal of my study is to reveal how, in fact, through these exhibitions of non-Western art, MoMA further inscribed and defined the peripheries of the modernist canon. So why do these MoMA exhibitions matter today? In October 2019, MoMA reopened its galleries, its renovation expanded galleries. In their communications about the so-called new MoMA, its curators and director Gwen Lowry are emphasizing a new vision, inclusive of art from outside Western Europe and the US. And here we're looking at an image of their CMAP web platform, as well as the works that they installed when Trump issued the ban, the immigration ban, and they were works largely from the Middle East. So the Glen Rower they're emphasizing a new vision of inclusive of art from outside Western Europe and the US. My research is the first to draw attention to a collection of 30 exhibitions of art from outside Western Europe and the US on view at MoMA in its earliest decades. In acknowledging and documenting this high level of internationalism in its New York galleries during those early years, I show how these exhibitions contributed to the museum's shaping of the story of modernism as Eurocentric. As such, my study can be a model for unpacking the histories of the marginalization of art from outside Western Europe and the US at MoMA and other peer institutions that moves beyond the presumed and binary narratives of inclusion and exclusion still current today. It also serves as a warning call for museums and galleries actively trying to be inclusive of geographically diverse narratives of modernism, that inclusion alone does not affect change in those age-old stories dominated all too often by narratives that privilege white Western male artists. Thank you, and sorry, now I went slightly over my time there.
Thank you so much, Gwen. That was fantastic. Really forensic research. Really fantastic presentation there. I'll introduce the next presenter, who's also going to be presenting remotely, Timothy Ellis-Dale. Timothy Ellis-Dale's research focuses on both visual culture and masculinity in early independent Ireland. He graduated with a BA in History from the University of Oxford in 2014, followed by an MA in History from Queen's in Belfast in 2016, and completed his PhD at Teesside University in 2020. And he's presented research at several conferences in Britain, Ireland and Spain, as well as co-organising the New Directions in Irish History Conference at Teesside in February 2019. He was appointed to the position of lecturer in the summer of 2020 and attained a fellowship of the Higher Education Academy in 2021. He's currently working on a project for which he was awarded funding through the British Academy's Small Grants Scheme, entitled Neutrality, Masculinity, Politics and Neutrality in Emergency Ireland. And just to get the title here, Timothy will speak on Discourses of Visibility and Self-Determination in the Irish Free State.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much for that introduction, and thank you for hosting me today remotely. You know, I'm really bowled over and quite impressed with kind of the very kind of sophisticated setup we've got here, and the fact that we did a test call and the internet clicker. You know, it's one of the most high tech virtual conferences I've ever done. So, you know, thank you so much. Really, really nicely put together. So I'll start by a quote from the author Desmond Ryan, okay, writing in 1932. So as Desmond Ryan starts his book, Michael Collins and the Invisible Army, 1932, with the following quote: "Over Dublin, the shadows lifted as the Civil War became a memory. Howth stood out as starkly as ever in the dim and winding bay. Sunlight bathed the great city." End quote. Here, in this quotation, in this passage, Ireland was emerging from the shadows and darkness that had blighted it during the Civil War and was entering into the light of day where it would be fully visible. Ryan wrote about the story of Michael Collins' Invisible Army between 1919 to 1921. By 1932, its successor, the Irish Defence Forces, was very visible indeed, as it appeared resplendent, as pictured in the image here, in the new dress uniforms that it wore at the Eucharistic Congress that very year. At the same time, an alternative invisible army, the IRA, existed in the shadows, seemingly threatening to overturn the social order of the state. So I'm just trying to get my... there we go. Brilliant. Sorry. So the point I want to make today is that discourses of visibility loom very large in the Irish Free State. And this was something that I consistently encountered when I did my PhD research. Initially, when I set out on this piece of research, I had sought to examine the role of visual artifacts, that is to say, photographs, paintings, and political cartoons in the political culture of the Free State, under the general heading of visual culture. In the early stages of my research, however, I encountered a very thought-provoking definition of visual culture from Gillian Rose, that visual culture is more than just a series of visual artifacts. Rather, it should refer to, and I quote, the plethora of ways in which the visual is part of social life, end quote. And as I set out upon my research, I discovered that discourses of being watched, surveillance, light and darkness, and most of all, visibility and invisibility emerged time and time again in the sources I examined. As Andrea Brignenti has argued, visibility should be understood as a fully fledged sociological category and not merely a physiological process. Chiefly, visibility has a crucial, albeit ambiguous, relationship with the workings of power in society. Yet the significance of visibility as a socio-political category in the Irish Free State has not yet attracted a significant degree of scholarly attention. While there has been much excellent work done on individual aspects of visual culture, such as Roisin Kennedy's work on art, Kevin Rockett on film and film censorship, and Orla Fitzpatrick on photography, as well as work on some of the individual spectacles that existed in the Free State, such as Mike Croning's work on Tolton, pictured here, and David Holmes on the 1932 Eucharistic Congress, little scholarship has yet been produced on the overall significance and discourse of visibility across the political culture of the Irish Free State. Sorry. There we go. So the Irish Free State was indeed an increasingly visual society. As Marshall McLuhan has famously argued, developments in media technology in the 19th and 20th centuries made vision the dominant sense in contemporary Western society. Developments in camera technology, namely the introduction of flash photography in the 1930s, made the presence of photography in everyday life more ubiquitous. With Eamon de Valera's Irish Press newspaper leading the way, newspapers became increasingly image-heavy. Cinema going also experienced a significant boom in this period. And finally, the gradual introduction of electric lighting, both in the streets and at home, made possible, in part through the Shannon hydroelectric scheme, pictured here, made social life, at least in urban areas. Rural areas would have to wait until the rural electricity scheme after the Second World War, made social life in urban areas increasingly visible. And as the range of the visible became increased, visibility became increasingly vital for legitimacy, and the invisible increasingly became delegitimized. As Michel Foucault has argued, visibility is vital and essential for the exercise of power and legitimacy as modern societies, as, and I quote, the exercise of discipline presupposes a mechanism that coerces by means of observation, and the means of coercion make those on whom they are applied clearly visible. From surveillance follows discipline and in turn legitimacy. And as the range of visible objects increases through technological changes, it follows that the invisible increasingly becomes an object of anxiety and thus is delegitimized. I argue that legitimacy is the most vital form of capital for any state seeking to strengthen its claim to self-determination. I argue in this paper that visibility was vital for the construction of legitimacy in the Irish Free State through three examples. First, the delegitimization of the dissident Republican by treaty-out opponents through their construction as invisible, shadowy figures. Second, the way in which Eamon de Valera's government used invisibility as a means of delegitimizing and weakening the office of Governor-General, and thus advancing the cause of Irish self-determination. And finally, the way in which visibility contributed to the construction of the state's Catholic identity during the 1932 Eucharistic Congress. So, during the Civil War, the National Army, fighting on the pro-treaty side in acceptance of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, was keen to make sure it was seen to be eminently visible. Particularly in the early stages of the Civil War, photographs of the National Army appeared virtually every day in Irish newspapers. Free State authorities were able to ensure that photographs depicted national troops in a positive light through the distribution by military authorities of permits to press photographers like Joseph Cashman and W.D. Hogan, who then had to submit their work to the military censor. Later in the conflict, military authorities made plans to hire an official army photographer who would be responsible, and I quote, for doing all the photographic work in An Teoglach, the National Army Journal, and photographic work in connection with army publicity, end quote. The anti-treaty IRA, in contrast, did not enjoy comparable access to photographic publicity, having to make do instead with the acerbic cartoons of Constance Markovich, which you can see in my slide here, one of Markovich's Free State Freaks cartoons of Desmond Fitzgerald. Perhaps most significantly, the National Army was clad in a recognisable uniform, which itself functioned as a symbol of legitimacy and Irish self-determination. The uniform was green, not British khaki. As Gavin Foster notes, it eschewed the British V-shaped style collar in favour of rounded collars, giving it a more military appearance, which was much more German in appearance than British. The Freeman's Journal similarly noted that smart designs have been selected for the new uniforms. These include privates' double-bested greatcoats, somewhat like the German patterns. The officers' tunics are rather after the French style, end quote. Uniform, in particular, signified sovereignty, self-determination, and a sense of international respectability. One soldier who had initial difficulties, for instance, receiving a uniform, complained to the Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Free State Army, General Richard Mulcahy, and I quote, "If I had not got the uniform, I would have been acting as a soldier in civilian dress, which is contrary to the recognised rules of warfare." Now, the IRA gunman, meanwhile, was constructed as a disreputable, shadowy figure who avoided the light of day. Members of the anti-treaty IRA were depicted by their treatyized opponents as irregulars, that is to say, unmanly cowards who did not wear a uniform, rendering them liable to be a target by snipers, and who lurked in the shadows. The Donegal News in 1922, for example, noted an unspeakably discreditable and cowardly ruse adopted by irregulars, where the leader of an irregular party ambushed national soldiers dressed as a priest. Sean Keating's famous painting, depicted here, Night's Candles Are Burnt Out, the old IRA gunman, who can be seen skulking in shadows speaking to the businessman, is partially obscured. 10 years after the Civil War, the gunman also appears in a rather similar fashion to Keating's painting as a shadow in a famous poster produced by Cumann Gael during the 1932 election campaign. And most interestingly, the discourse of the disreputable and invisible IRA gunman versus the virtuous and crucially visible man in uniform carried well into the 1930s in debates over the blue shirt. And this is no coincidence, given the fact that many veterans of the National Army joined the blue shirts. Indeed, the first incarnation of the blue shirts was as the Army Comrades Association. During a debate on the 1934 Uniforms Bill, which sought to ban the wearing of political uniforms in the state, chiefly the blue shirt, Desmond Fitzgerald declared, and I quote, "The only type of uniform that members of that body, i.e. the IRA, indulge in is the mask in order to conceal the images of the men, because they have always wanted to avoid the light of day." And having been tarred with the brush of the shadow of the gunman by Cumann Gael's notorious election poster, Eamon de Valera responded in kind. On taking office as president of the Executive Council in 1932, de Valera sought to remove all symbols of the British imperial crown, chiefly that of Governor General. This particular symbol would be removed and thus delegitimized through visibility. In November 1932, Donal O'Buchala was appointed to the post. In a draft policy document which had been prepared for the Executive Council, it was decided that, and I quote, "The Governor-General must, unless specifically authorised to the contrary, refrain from the performance of any act of an official or quasi-official nature." Rather than moving into the Viceregal Lodge in Phoenix Park, which had very obvious connotations with British imperialism, O'Buchala resided instead in a suburban house known as Gortleitra in Monkstown, Dunleary. And O'Buchala's invisibility drew much public comment. Opposition TDs criticised De Valera's use of funds to support an office where the office holder seemingly did nothing and was virtually invisible. Frank McDermott remarked, "Where is the need for these new sums of money we are asked to provide for the Governor-General? The most important feature of his duties is that he is to remain invisible." And George Cecil Bennett similarly remarked that many citizens never saw him. The press also widely remarked on O'Buchala's invisibility. The Irish press noted that O'Buchala drove up alone to Governor buildings and, on alighting from his car, hurried up the steps to avoid photographers. In 1934, Dublin Opinion, and I've got a cartoon from Dublin Opinion pictured here from 1938, Dublin Opinion imagined a visit by De Valera to Gortleitra. Over tea and cake, O'Buchala recounted that, "I was half tempted to go on the technical instruction exhibition with my overcoat buttoned up, but I didn't." And while the symbol of Governor-General was made invisible to aid self-determination, sorry, just went in the slide transition. Yep, the visibility of other symbols could be enhanced to support this process. The beginning of De Valera's process of denigration of British imperial symbols coincided in June 1932 with the 31st International Eucharistic Congress, which would make the state's Catholic heritage eminently visible for all the world to see. The organisers of the Congress promised journalists that they would have special positions from which photographers will be able to take good pictures of proceedings. During the Congress itself, senior figures were very conscious of the presence of the world's photographers and its cameras. The Ulster Herald noted that the Cardinal Legate consciously stopped to permit photographers to take photographs. The Father Matthew record noted that during the solemn moments of the great open-air ceremonies there pervaded the occasional click of photographers' cameras. And over the week, the Congress produced an abundance of souvenir photographs, albums, and postcards. The most significant of these souvenir publications was the official 31st International Eucharistic Congress pictorial record, which consisted of over 100 pages of photographic coverage from the world's press. And in the eyes of its authors, the pictorial record offered proof of the piety and success of the Congress, and by extension, the legitimacy of the young Irish Free State. In the caption to this image here, the record noted that this picture is taken from the air and gives a good idea of the almost perfect order maintained by those taking part. Sorry. Those who attended the Congress consistently praised its sheer visual spectacle. The Archbishop of Wellington, Francis Wedgwood, described this event as the sight of his life. An observer from the Irish Catholic journal Assisi recalled that the scene that met my eyes as I looked out over the Phoenix Park from my position near the high altar was one of overwhelming grandeur. During the Congress itself, Dublin was lit up by searchlights, pictured here, which projected the Latin words adoramus, glorificamus, and laudamus onto the sky. Observers consistently emphasized the prevalence of light during the Congress. Before it took place, the tourist magazine predicted that the city will be illuminated from dusk until dawn. Dublin will be ablaze from devices from the new Shannon electric power station. The Derry Journal suggested that Dublin was in a state of darkless night, as it was impossible that the darkness could settle upon the glittering lights. The Columban, perhaps in an appointed comment on Ireland's situation as a beacon of Catholic morality and piety in a seemingly godless world, declared that Dublin, that is Ireland, was a light shining in the darkness, and much of the darkness did not and does not comprehend. And due to the Congress's sheer spectacle, its organisers were deeply conscious of the fact that the world would be watching Ireland closely. A press release from the Congress Publicity Department noted that men and women who never saw Ireland will come gladly over the seas to salute the little nation whose heroic history and spiritual qualities have made her an object of curiosity and admiration. Just before the Congress, the Sunday Digest remarked that the eyes of the Roman Catholic world are centred on Dublin. The Irish Catholic similarly reminded its readers, "We shall become, for the brief period, the cynosure of neighbouring eyes. These eyes will be, for the most part, friendly. We enjoy at present a considerable amount of goodwill among the nations, but some will be critical and all will be curious." And what is striking about these statements is the discourse of a young state being watched by the world as it made itself visible through the proceedings of the Congress. 9 years earlier, An Tóglacht, the journal of the Treaty-ite National Army, offered its readers this morale boost. It declared, "The world is watching us all. If we do our best, we can make our army the finest army in the world." As Sean Donnelly has argued, scholars have yet to fully appreciate the profound influence that such an awareness of being watched exerted over Irish nationalist leadership. And this sense of being watched assumes a greater significance when we consider the fact that the Free State was ultimately a post-conflict and post-revolutionary society which existed in a broader post-war international context which prized respectability, conservatism, and indeed, to quote US President Warren G. Harding, a return to normalcy. In order to prove that the state was indeed capable of full self-determination in an increasingly visual world, the state had to visibly demonstrate its capacity for self-determination. It required a visible army, properly uniformed so as to follow the internationally recognized rules of warfare to overcome its shadowy insurgent opponents. It required a visible, independent head of state and government, with the remnants of British imperialism being, in the words of Dorothy McCardle, consigned to exterior darkness. It required the ability to put in a spectacle for the world when it came to visit Dublin in the June of 1932. It was in this context that visibility was prized and invisibility was shunned. In the political culture of the Irish Free State, invisibility was associated with the shadow of the gunman, political impotence, and shame. Visibility, on the other hand, conferred respectability, honesty, order, and chiefly legitimacy. Thank you very much. I do apologize, I went over slightly, but thank you very much. Okay.
That's great. Thanks so much for that, Timothy. That was really fascinating. It felt like a really suggestive way of looking at this period in Irish history that I think many of us will want to unpack and think through. I will introduce our third speaker now, who will present in person, and then we will have time for questions after that. Fiona Gannon is a writer, researcher, and artist living and working in Dublin. She's worked in both education as well as public engagement contexts and is currently working with Jenny Guy on future development of the art and education project Art School. She was assistant editor for the book Curriculum, Contemporary Art Goes to School, which was published by Intellect in 2020, and has contributed reviews to Art Monthly, Paper Visual Art, and Critical Bastards. So Fiona is going to speak about the brain of Europe, an underdeveloped knowledge economy. Great.
Great. Can you hear me okay? So before I start, I just wanted to say thank you so much to the organisers, Stephen, Nathan, Lisa, Sophie, just for letting me kind of put this paper together and to present it here today. I'm really, really grateful. I'm also heavily indebted to Dorothy Walker's archive in Nival, which is an amazing public asset, and I can't kind of speak to that enough. We're so lucky to have that. So I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to kind of launch straight in. So there we go. So in 1974, during the time of his exhibition, A Secret Block for a Secret Person in Ireland, Joseph Boyce visited Ireland and gave talks in Dublin, Belfast, Derry, Limerick and Cork. According to Caroline Tisdale's first periodic report to the European Economic Community on the feasibility of funding a free international university for creativity and interdisciplinary research, bit of a mouthful, but stick with me anyway. Boyce held a meeting with some 200 attendees that coincided with his talk at the Municipal Gallery, now the Hugh Lane in Dublin. Here he first broached the possibility of opening a free international university, and because of this meeting, Tisdale follows that support of the leading figures in Dublin cultural initiatives has been secured, as well as an active interest from those engaged in fields outside the cultural area, notably psychiatry and sociology. She is likely, the leading cultural figures were likely Dorothy Walker and Robin Walker, who played a big role on the Dublin side of the project, and the person engaged in psychiatry was likely former chief psychiatrist of the Eastern Health Board, Ivor Brown, or perhaps Paddy Wally, his associate. The enthusiasm of this cohort is an area worthy of further investigation, but likely it existed in the community in a cautious way. When I interviewed Dennis Bergen, a writer, educationalist and consultant who features in Tisdale's subsequent report to the EEC of September 1975, he said that people were likely interested, but any professor already employed by another institution would probably have wanted the Free International University to be up and running before weighing up whether or not to publicly kind of commit to that project. So this is a quote from Dennis Bergen's feasibility report, which is included in Tisdale's own report to the EEC. He drafted an initial feasibility study of a Kilmainham city campus for the Institute of Irish Studies in the summer of 1975. The institute was headed by Noel Cleary, who organised meetings towards this idea with much of the same group who expressed interest in the Free International University. In Tisdale's second report of September 1975, she mentions that the city campus project arose from talks around the Free International University, and it seems like the exchange between ideas was quite organic between these groups. The city campus would have been administered by an educational trust, which should incorporate the goodwill and assets of the Institute of Irish Studies and the Language Centre of Ireland, end quote. The campus would then have hosted Ivor Brown's Foundation for Human Development, as well as the Free International University. And when the Free International University was planning to get set up in a provisional way in Milltown, where the trustees had secured a deal on a Marist Fathers seminary complex, which they had to decline with lack of funding, the Foundation for Human Development would have been invited to set up base there too, and then they both would have joined the city campus once that was established by Noel Cleary in Kilmainham at a later date. So Dennis Bergen said that meetings of the time, although he couldn't remember attending one on the Free University specifically, and within that scene were often informal, in someone's house usually, and there wouldn't have been any minutes taken or any kind of agenda, but likely these were conversational in nature. In Caroline Tisdale's first periodic report submitted to the EEC, she mentions the prospect of housing the FIU in the Royal Hospital, Kilmainham. Tisdale suggests that this could accompany the EEC's prospective Institute for the Environment and Institute for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions. The Institute for the Environment was never established in Dublin, as far as I'm aware. Maybe I'm wrong, but I couldn't see any evidence of that. But the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions was established in 1975 and is still currently located in Loughlinstown, County Dublin. Its role is to provide knowledge to assist in the development of better social, employment and work-related policies. This might seem like an odd pairing, but actually the Free University's main aim, according to Tisdale's second report, and I have a slide up on the screen now which draws from that report again, was to establish an alternative economy in Ireland. a sort of testing ground for a different model on the periphery of Europe. Ireland had just joined the EUC in 1973 after having been largely protectionist, for want of a better word, but since the foundation of the state, and largely dependent on Britain still for exports. So while Britain was gearing up to join the EEC, Ireland had been kind of anticipating the shift towards added competition. And the resulting picture was that Ireland, now open to free trade in Europe, was on the threshold of development. And Joseph Beuys and Heinrich Böll felt compelled to advocate for its particular potential as a place to model a different form of economics. Quote, and this is on the kind of bottom half of that slide, the Free University's aim is to develop a more organic model. In this model, economics is not restricted to physical goods, but is once more expanded to include the total resources of a country, cultural and spiritual, end quote. The Free International University, as pitched to the EEC in September 1975, would function on the basis of two forms of income. One being direct financial subsidy, and the other commissions for research and reports on cultural, economic and social issues. It would charge no student fees, and students would be expected to seek grants instead from their respective countries. The research commissions would cover only about a third of the running costs, and the other 2/3 would have needed direct funding. The trustees were also seeking donations of equipment and facilities alongside this. Tisdale had set out in her first periodic report of March 1975 that funding would be sought from large international bodies such as the European Economic Commission or UNESCO, from foundations such as the Gulbenkian Foundation, from individuals, from local industry, from individual governments, just for student grants only, from governments, just the student grants part, and then through nominal charges for students. I have not as of yet discovered what response the EEC had to this proposal or what became of the link with the Gulbenkian Foundation. From Dorothy Walker's archive, I found that she had reached out to Charles Gordon Lambert and J.C. Robinson, Secretary at Arthur Guinness, and I'm sure many others. However, Ireland was experiencing a major period of inflation and financial difficulty. And Walker found it hard to gather any major funding at a local level at the time. She reached out to notify the Department of Education of the project, though not for funding, as that would have compromised the autonomy of the project as it was envisaged. And in a letter dated 28th of September 1976, a year after the submission of Tisdale's second report to the EEC, she writes to London-based trustee Robert McDowell that the only way forward is through big official bodies. And this is kind of hard to read, or maybe it's not on the big screen, but just the last sentence there, she writes that people are still full of goodwill and ideas, but no one has any money. Big official bodies are the only answer. There was a period of inflation that was happening at the time in the 70s. So if funding had come through and the project gotten what it needed to get off the ground or reach the ground, what kind of economy might the FIU have produced within the city campus? By looking at Tisdale's second, more developed report and proposal as a model or as a maquette, it could be possible to imagine the operation that the Free University and city campus might have embodied. At a practice-based level, we can imagine a kind of specialist, interdisciplinary, complementary relationship that could have evolved between the Free University and the NCAD, as well as the potential use of the former flour-turned-textile Kilmainham mill and the use of the meadows within the grounds of the Royal Hospital for growing food. And Dorothy Walker, in her proposal to the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland for selecting Kilmainham as an area to kind of to study for the purposes of developing the city campus, Walker suggests that, quote, the 20 acres of neglected gardens, orchards and vegetable gardens at the Royal Hospital could be rehabilitated, both for amenity purposes and to provide fresh food for the dwellers of the area and to possible restaurants that might set up to provide service for the Kilmainham personnel. The social sculpture of former psychiatrist Ivor Brown, with his focus on the heart as the central thinking organ, rather than the brain, would have been incredibly resonant with Beuys's thinking on the social organism. And this affinity might have created some really productive work on socially embedded cognitive health. Ivor Brown kind of moved away in his career from strict kind of psychiatry to social work, and he's like known for that kind of shift as a very purposeful shift that he made in his own career. So the potential was huge, but to try and imagine the economy of these relationships, it's important to get the organizational structure of the Free University down in some way to picture out how the project might have manifested. So the Free International University will be set up as a non-for-profit charity, independent from departments of education, with a board of trustees composed initially of those involved in establishing it. There would be no director. There would be a nucleus of staff for continuity and a small body of regular workshop staff, but otherwise the policy would be to offer short-term, renewable contracts based on the research and workshop projects in hand. Conferences would have been an important part of structuring that. There would be no professorships or departmental headships. Staff-student relationships would have been reciprocal, with students encouraged to propose research projects and workshop initiatives. The work of the Free International University would be distributed along 3 levels: faculty seminars, research, and the Open University. The seminars would tackle common problems with demonstrations of the approaches of various disciplines. The researchers providing the working teaching model would have backgrounds with a range of experience in other fields. And then the Open University would involve the public through activities such as publishing, film, television, programming, conferences, exhibitions, and workshops, which would also act as evening classes open to a wider public. How the 3 levels would interact, it is suggested might follow a logic of organising a seminar around a raised topic and then developing either workshops or a research project or both, with funding being sought for the research in question. Students would not be awarded any degrees nor postgraduate qualifications, but will be credited for their contribution to research projects and would receive evidence of achievement in workshops. The network of contacts the students were exposed to would enable them to take up employment or independent work upon completion of their studies. By scanning through the initial staff list, and I've just kind of pulled this from the paper and just kind of put it on a slide so we can just kind of look at that together. But by scanning through this, I've kind of pulled out a thread that I saw emerging, which was like, if you look at the backgrounds of each of these professors who would have kind of started the university, like Nina Sutton is a journalist, Tapio Varis is a mass media critic, Simon Hartog's a filmmaker, Vincent Porter a writer specialising in film, Dorothy Walker is a writer, and then Caroline Tisdale, she used to write for The Guardian. But this, coupled with the Open University's activities such as filmmaking, broadcasting or publishing, a common thread emerges of media production. And reading further into the individual interests of those listed, such as Tapio Varis, a common concern about the implications of mass communication or mass media becomes apparent, as it does in Tisdale's proposal more broadly. This is from Tisdale's proposal, and she kind of really explicitly says, like, the development of new means of processing information and research into democratically accessible forms will be an important function of the school. The staff of the proposed Free International University seem to have wanted to accrue resistance to a sort of unreciprocal flow of media by democratising its production and dissemination. It could be argued that the Free International University, as proposed for Dublin, might have acted as a kind of research and media centre, constructing new forms of knowledge and distribution networks. So Investopedia's entry on the knowledge economy describes the disparity between developed and underdeveloped countries in terms of the type of industries that they engage in. Quote, developing economies, and this is on the slide, developing economies tend to be heavily focused on agriculture and manufacturing, while highly developed countries have a larger share of service-related activities. This includes knowledge-based economic activities such as research, technical support, and consulting. The Free International University's R&D Centre would have muddied these disparities. As well as broadcasting, publishing, filmmaking and event production, the Free University would have been engaged in many forms of sculpture and art making, craft, likely in cooperation with the NCD, and it's also very likely that Beuys, a co-founder of the German Green Party, would have included agriculture in the school's economic thinking, as he took issue with the lack of support in this area. Quote, and this is from a book called What is Money, which documents a debate that took place between Beuys and a banker and 2 professors, I think one of political economy and the other one might have been of finance, but I can't remember. But he says that, yeah, if a young idealist wants to do something with agriculture, he doesn't get a penny. If he can't offer value, if he can't prove what he is attempting can be converted into a value with which he can pay back the bank. So the next two slides, pardon me, I'm breathing into the microphone. The next two slides show, can you hear me? Okay. The next two slides show drawings that Boyce did in the Municipal Gallery as part of his talk in 1974. In the first, which is the one here, in the first drawing, analysis is inscribed over what looks like either a group of people, I think it probably is a group of people, or I was thinking it also looks a bit like a set of standing stones, I don't know. But analysis is inscribed over it, and it seems to be acting as this kind of focal lens between myth, which is on the left, and it's kind of faint, but you can see it kind of under this lightning bolt. And then on the right, the sun state, which is kind of a utopic social form. This element of the sun state appears in another drawing Boyce did at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago when he was promoting his Free International University in the United States, also in 1974. And as Tisdale indicated in her first periodic report of March 1975, Boyce held a meeting at the Municipal where he first introduced his idea for the Free University in Ireland. These are then quite likely to be diagrams of the living social organism he envisaged the school would be, the ecological and economic model as he saw it. In the second drawing, the central bank stands next to the heart of the social organism, revitalising the system. The bank looks almost as if it's on a sort of a pendulum. It's this circle next to the heart, and it's sort of like over towards the right of the image. The bank looks almost as if it's on a pendulum, swinging from the right, where the words social, indecipherable, value, and brotherhood reside, towards the left, where art, science, creativity, and freedom reside. The heart sits atop a sort of an antenna that seems to be radiating energy. Above the heart are the words democracy, government, and equality as the middle terms within this sort of binary. Boyce's take on economics is sort of nebulous and like unresolved. Threads of ideas hang together in a loose way, much like in these drawings. Boyce wasn't capitalist or socialist, but was seeking out something else. He placed great importance on the potential of a socially responsible banking system who would adjust production according to the money people had in excess of their spending needs. In this way, savings would no longer be savings, but an indication of people having enough and a measurement to adjust production accordingly. He believed in the importance of entrepreneurialism, with the means of production in neither private nor state hands. Work would be of public benefit, and all money issued would be matched by the goods and income produced, with any extra sent back to the bank for recirculation without ever accruing any interest. Money would act to support democracy and income, and work would be separated, with money acting as a sort of a rights document, as he called it. The economy would not be centrally planned by any Politburo, but by free creative enterprises. So, philosopher and Brazil's former Minister for Strategic Affairs, Roberto Mangabeira Unger, describes the knowledge economy as, and this is a bit of a mouthful, so I'll say it kind of slowly, the accumulation of capital, technology-relevant capabilities, and science in the conduct of productive activity. Its characteristic ideal is permanent innovation and the maintenance of coherence and momentum in the planning of production with a decentralization of initiative. Imagination is also a key theme for Unger in his book, The Knowledge Economy, where he describes that the way we work together might begin to resemble the imaginative workings of the mind, with production plans becoming continuously revised by the team and responsibilities between actors becoming less distinct. Quote, and this is from an interview with Joe Fidgen on BBC Radio 4 in a show called Analysis. The aim is the expansion of humanity. We become more human by becoming more godlike. So these two seem miles apart, and yet there are similarities. The focus on entrepreneurialism and collective capacities, as well as on ideas such as decentralization, on the flexibility of roles and creative independence. The biggest and starkest difference between the two models can probably best be thought in the distinction between Unger's idea of permanent innovation and Boyce's permanent conference. To Unger, the main aim of the knowledge economy is to stave off the economic law of diminishing returns and maintain growth by creating a field of decentralised co-production that maintains innovation as a constant by decreasing barriers and increasing the capacities of automation, computing, additive manufacturing, etc. Whereas Boyce, on the other hand, prioritises the idea of a permanent conference, making democracy the constant, establishing money's primary role as an aid to this democracy and not allowing it accrue any kind of interest. For Unger, creativity leads to capital, and for Boyce, creativity is capital in and of itself. Placing innovation on a line of perpetual growth that somehow never dips sounds eerily recognisable in terms of the kind of high-strung buzz that it evokes. The idea reminds me of the writing of Mackenzie Wark, who in her book Capital is Dead, Is This Something Worse?, coins two new classes that she sees as emerging from the commodification of information, the hacker and the vectoralist. The hacker produces new information, while the vectoralist owns the legal and technical protocols that ensure its scarcity. She describes in all too familiar terms the tension of working to produce new information and how irregular this time spent on this kind of work is. Quote, "It happens when it happens, including time spent napping or pulling all-nighters. The workplace nightmare of the worker is having to make the same thing over and over again against the pressure of the clock. The workplace nightmare of the hacker is to produce different things over and over again against the pressure of the clock." In this light, the idea of perpetual innovation sounds far from ideal, but the idea of perpetual conference doesn't sound so good either. The words perpetual, constant, and ongoing can feel beleaguering when thinking about work in the context of an atomised freelance economy set within cost of living and housing crises. One thing Dorothy Walker saw as important within the Milltown Marist Fathers complex, which was the site proposed as a temporary spot for the Free University to get up and kind of running, was that it had dormitories to house students. She also makes mention of small-scale housing within Kilmainham, that could have accommodated craft workers, visiting researchers and personnel of the various partner institutions once the city campus got going. This is pulled from her proposal to the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland for studying the Kilmainham for this city kind of campus idea. And she writes that at present there's a large empty warehouse at Mount Brown, which could be used for the art studios of the Free International School. There's also a mill on the River Cammock, which offers possibilities for craft use, and small-scale housing, which, as well as the present householders, would be appropriate for craft workers, students, visiting professors, and the personnel of the various institutions using the Royal Hospital. I just wanted to kind of pull out where I think those sites are. So this is one Mount Brown, and so this is the old road distillery. So that the kind of OSI map that I think is from the 1900s, I think it's like I forget, but it's from the 19th century. The black and white one there, that's the old Roe whiskey distillery on Mount Brown. And then to the right then, also in black and white, that's the manager's house. And there's a newer kind of OSI map below the old one, and you can kind of see that I should have a laser pointer with me, but let's see if I can do it with my hand. Yeah, this part here is like a very large warehouse. That's the old malting warehouse. But so the manager's house is currently in use by St. Vincent de Paul as a homeless shelter. And then the warehouse is actually, you might have seen in the news recently, Tahani House, where over 100 different people who've been renting there have been given notice they're being evicted. So it's just putting that kind of in current context. And this is Kilmainham Mill. It's an etching of the water wheel on the River Cammock. And then on the right, that's a more recent picture, but Dublin City Council has just bought Kilmainham Mill and is currently actually doing conservation work on it to kind of revitalise it, and there's an intention that it'll be kind of a cultural centre and tourist destination. There might be, I could be wrong, but I think there was talk of some sort of like classes or something along those lines linking into its history as a textile mill, and flour before that, but I'd say it'll be the textile element focused on. Oh, whoops, not yet. Okay, sorry. The free workshops, which would have doubled as evening classes for locals, was apparently a very welcome consideration that tied in with the open form of the university, which was intended precisely to prevent the organisation from becoming a closed-off think tank, as Tisdale writes in a letter to Dorothy in the winter of 1976. It's likely that this porous structure, though lean, might have been productive in terms of the task at hand, with direct funding, regular turnover of visiting researchers and projects, and ideally a feeling of community ownership. Eventually, this might have provided a foundation from which locals and visiting researchers could develop and test a variety of forms of production, trade, and even agriculture as an ongoing European project. It might have produced an effective forum for reciprocal exchange, particularly if locals played a part in decision-making, or could even become trustees as well. What we have today is the accumulation and build-up of several economic models that don't overwrite each other but intermingle: peasant, agrarian economics, clock-on industrial worker economics, welfare economics, knowledge and attention economics. And while the knowledge economy aims for ever-expanding fluidity of information, openness and cooperation, how that meets a wider context of pre-existing social relations and power relations transforms its framework. The myth of the level playing field rears its head repeatedly in isolated economic models. Thomas Kenneth Whitaker's Grey Book was absorbed into policy quite quickly in 1958 due to the difficulty the country had been facing with emigration and changing international relations. And arguably, we're at a much starker point of necessary revision right now. At a time when, and hopefully without giving the snowball effect of today's news media and Twitter feeds, we need to resolve our housing situation, and we need to resolve our infrastructural relationships ecologically. We need to resolve our energy dependencies, in which we need to think our trade routes and our arrangements. This project looks like it might have been useful, not only in terms of the opportunity it might have given to the European economic community to try out less extractive models of exchange on underdeveloped ground, but also in terms of the kind of critical education the school might have provided in an increasingly media-saturated world. Sorry, I keep doing that. Where we are now faced with insidious ideas such as cognitive warfare. Analysis and critical thinking are what democracy needs right now, and UNESCO's Learning City of 2021 could be put to better use. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Fiona.
Cheers.
If you join me here, and we'll. Yeah. We had a little buffer there, which allowed people to run over a little bit. We have a couple of minutes left for questions. I think those were three really great presentations. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'll open it straight to the floor. I mean, I have things that I could certainly ask about, but given we have just a few minutes left, I wonder if anybody else would like to jump in.
I don't even know if I can ask this because it's very convoluted and I only wrote it down because I thought there'd be a lot of time. But essentially, I'm really interested in the idea in two books, Larry Shiner's The Invention of Art and Nicholas Luhmann's Systems of Art. In Shiner's The Invention of Art, he traces, quote unquote, Western art evolving from a ritual where there's no audience separation from the actual event itself, and art has a very specific purpose. You have the evolution from the guild model, the master apprenticeship model, serving a patron, to a model that we have now where you go to art college, you serve an open market, and so on and so forth. And so at the current moment we exist in, we have a system where an African mask or a Persian rug can be included in the context of a modern art museum, but that doesn't necessarily go the other way around. Like, you can't put Tracy Emin's bed in the context of an African mask ritual or something like that. So my question is kind of like, when we can, but it also goes the other way. Like, we can put art museums in non-Western countries and they still function as art museums. We can put art colleges in the Western sense in non-Western countries and they still function as that. So this is mostly provoked by kind of Gwen's presentation, but I'm just wondering, considering that, how do you differentiate Western and non-Western art, if that makes sense? Sorry, I had a longer question, but I tried to make it short.
No, I appreciate that, Salon. Have we got Gwen and Timothy? Yeah, Gwen, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think the word forensic was used to describe my presentation, which is true. So I've been very precise in how I'm defining non-Western art in the context of my paper and my study, which is really art that was created by artists or practitioners outside of Western Europe and North America. So in the context of the paper I presented, that's how I'm defining non-Western art. And I think, I don't know if I can answer your question or thought precisely or directly, but I think for me, using post and critical theory studies to unpack the museum, which is, I think you're indicating is a Western construct, and it's a Western colonial construct, is one of the tools I use that I find very helpful for approaching that dichotomy that you've just laid out. I don't know if I've answered your question, sorry.
Thanks, Gwen. Have we time for another question or two? Would anybody else like to come in? If not, I mean, or if people need another moment, I mean, there was one thing I was really struck by, which was you spoke about the kind of total resources of a country. This was a quotation about, and this idea of the resource seems very important in relation to discourses of self-determination. Both, I mean, in terms of the Boysian approach to education, where we're thinking not of transmitting information, but of identifying the resources of those who are participants in the kind of educational exchange. I think also in relation to Timothy's paper, he referenced the hydroelectric power station. So in a very different sense, but another way in which that moment of identifying the resources of a country at a sort of at a moment of sort of self-determination becomes a matter of urgency. And I suppose maybe it refers to what you asked, Sinan, as well, about this idea of the approach to resources as extractive. And maybe if we looked at, if we could maybe, and perhaps this isn't granular or forensic enough, but I wonder if we could think of MoMA's approach to sort of non-Western art in this period as sort of enacting a kind of extractive approach to art as resource. So I may be trying to tie things together too neatly here, but I wonder if that resonates with you at all, or?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I think, yeah, the idea of resource is, I don't know, I think that's probably better there. I can hear my voice a bit clearer. But the idea of resource is, I guess it's sort of a incredibly fluid thing, isn't it? And yeah, God, I don't know what to say to that. I guess.
Maybe I've put you on the spot with
No,
a term that you
no,
mightn't
no.
have been.
But maybe it's interesting in terms of the art education model, in terms of also producing art as, maybe that is also a research, a resource, and then that would probably need to be unpacked as well. But yeah, it's interesting. I don't really know. I don't really have anything else to say to that. But yeah, it's interesting.
If it's not a term that maybe you've been thinking through in those respects.
Not yet.
And I mean, I wonder if Timothy, you were thinking about that in relation to the electricity supply board. I know you mentioned Ard na Crusha, this sense of generating light from the land, from the resources of the new state. I don't know whether that's something that you had in mind in relation to, I mean, I thought your presentation on visibility and invisibility was fascinating in terms of thinking about this period. No,
I mean, I think Ard na Crusha is really fascinating, particularly in sort of context of net zero as well. You know, the Irish Free State in the 1920s, I think, was virtually 98% renewable, clean electricity as well. And it's quite interesting that on the subject of resources as well, this is Irish energy from Ireland itself. You're not using coal, which is seen as kind of constructed as a British resource. And there's also kind of a nice little continental link there because, of course, it's the Siemens hydroelectric scheme, which requires German engineers. And this is kind of a way of kind of Ireland. I mean, I think it's a kind of a nice illustration of what Clifford Geertz refers to as the sort of tension between epochalism and essentialism within a new state. So a new state is partially kind of concerned with internal definitions of its essence, but it's also trying to kind of define itself in relation to the spirit of the age. And you can see that in both kind of ways with Ard na Crusha, definitely.
Thanks, Timothy. I mean, Gwen, I don't know if you'd like to speak to that question about extraction in relation to MoMA at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's at once extraction, so it's using an extreme wealth of resources to kind of mobilize that wealth of resources to position yourself to be able to say what you're going to extract and why, in order to serve, you know, museum's ends, but also when you see how interlinked museum is with US government policy and roles, then also the US own project of what you could call cultural imperialism. So I think it's at once extraction, but it's also exploitative extraction, right? Which maybe extraction always is. And then just tracing the long-term impact of that in terms of how spaces of art production and making were then simply rendered peripheral to what MoMA got to call kind of the central canon of modernism.
If we have time for one last question from the audience, if there's anybody who has anything they'd
if that got off the ground to any degree. I'm not so familiar. I did, but it's a good few years ago, was aware of the Free University, whether it had any connection in Dublin, whether it had any connection with BICIS or not, initiative, I don't know. And just generally what has been felt in relation to this sort of approach that he was and others suggesting.
Is the question what was generally kind of felt about that approach at the time? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, and then really did it
yeah, what happened?
Did it happen?
Yeah. So like, as far as I can tell from, I'm heavily indebted to Dorothy Walker's archive. I was largely drawing on her letters and her kind of correspondences in trying to set it up. Dorothy Walker did, alongside Caroline Tisdale, a lot of work to try and establish funding and connections and kind of facilities to get it to be realised. But kind of, I think it was a timing thing, that there really wasn't that money. And then I'm not sure what happened with the EEC. The EEC was the kind of, that document was actually in a way a proposal to the EEC to fund it directly. And that would have been the 2/3 potentially funding of the university. I just don't think that it came through. But this is an ongoing research process, so I would like to kind of follow up on that and see, check other archives and see if there's any more to be gleaned. In terms of how it sort of was received here at the time, it's also something I want to follow up on. There are many people that I'd like to interview, including Ivor Brown, who I think would be a really interesting person to talk to, because he seemed to be part of that scene. There are kind of, I've heard mixed accounts of how the project was received at the time. But I think interviewing would be the next step. That's something I'd really like to pursue. Yeah.
Thanks, Fiona. And thanks also to Timothy and Gwen. Sorry, I don't know where I'm pointing. But yeah, I mean, I know you also mentioned you cited permanent conference. I think maybe we've been too conferenced out at this point in the day. So I think maybe we might conclude it there. We'll be picking things up in the morning at 10 o'clock with Roisin Kennedy's keynote. And we'll have a full day of activities again tomorrow, so we'll be back into permanent conference mode then. But yeah, it just remains to thank our three speakers. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to our speakers and to all the speakers today who've really contributed to a really rich set of conversations. So if you could join me in saying thank you.